I think it's a pretty compelling case that the war is still a live ball, even if they're not necessarily dropping bombs.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yasmin Vasugian. Today on the show, the big question, are we still at war? Well, it depends on who you're asking. So the Trump administration just hit its deadline to seek congressional approval to stay in a war with Iran. But Republicans and Democrats are arguing over what that actually means and whether Congress needs to act. Plus, the battle of the tech billionaires. Elon Musk just stepped off the stand in the case against OpenAI CEO Sam Altman, how their fight could shake up the AI race. Up first, though, the U.S. war with Iran just hit the 60-day mark. That is the deadline, according to the 1973 War Powers Resolution, for the president to finally get congressional authorization for the conflict or pull out military forces altogether and end this war. President Trump has not done that yet. Congress has not signed off. But the Trump administration is now making the case that the current ceasefire is essentially pausing this war clock. And despite bipartisan calls to outline clear military objectives in the war with Iran, neither the Pentagon nor the president has seemed to satisfy their demands. So who is actually keeping this war clock time over in Washington, D.C.? And what options do lawmakers actually have to rein in the president in this war, if they even wanted to? For this, I want to bring in NBC News chief Capitol Hill correspondent, Ryan Nobles. Hi, Ryan.
Hi, Yaz.
Happy Friday, maybe?
Yeah. This turned out to be a much longer week, I think, than any of us anticipated. But yes, happy to see Friday here.
They all do, after all. So Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was on Capitol Hill this week. In a hearing with the Senate Armed Services Committee, he told Senator Tim Kaine that he did not believe we were at the 60-day mark.
We are in a ceasefire right now, which our understanding means the 60-day clock pauses or stops in a ceasefire. You're not in. Yeah. It's our understanding, just so you know.
Okay, well, I do not believe the statute would support that.
So it sounds to me like Senator Kaine does not believe Hegseth's assessment of whether or not the 60-day clock is still ongoing. Do you think they were taken by surprise with this?
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt that Senator Kaine was taken by surprise. I think that everybody on Capitol Hill was operating under this assumption that at least the February 28th started the clock and that at least May 1st was going to be the 60-day deadline and that there wasn't anything to indicate that the clock had stopped at any stage of the process. That was the first time that anybody from the administration had made that argument to leaders on Capitol Hill. And I think that most folks that have any sort of understanding of how the War Powers Act works and how that relates back to the Constitution and Congress's authority when it comes to declaring war would argue that that is that there's any precedent for that on any level. When you look at the fact that there is still an ongoing naval blockade of Iranian ports, which is an active military action, when you take into account the fact that there are still thousands of troops and sailors in the region, when you talk about the fact that they're in control of the Strait of Hormuz, I think it's a pretty compelling case that the war is still a live ball, even if they're not necessarily dropping bombs. I don't think legally the White House is on strong ground here, but they might not need to be, because if Congress doesn't feel the need to actually exert its authority here, the White House can do basically whatever they want, which is kind of been the trend line here through this second Trump administration.
You know, I just got to say, having just returned from the region, Ryan, everybody there believes that the United States is still at war with Iran, especially given the example that you just mentioned, which is the blockade that is happening at the Strait of Hormuz. That is what's kind of so perplexing to me when we hear from people like the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, in his testimony in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and your interview with House Speaker Mike Johnson, in which he said to you, we're not currently at war. And you actually pressed him on that.
But the president has called it a war. You're saying we're not at war right now?
You say you not had kinetic military action at the moment. We're policing the Strait of Hormuz and trying to get to a peace. The president and the administration are moving as aggressively as possible. There's nothing Congress can do to move that along any further. So we'll see how it plays out. That's my position.
Is this the positioning of most Republicans? considering what Speaker Johnson just said?
No, I wouldn't say most. I would say Republican leadership, which is a key distinction here, right? If you watch both the Senate and House hearings in which the Secretary Hegseth appeared before, you saw a lot of Republicans asking very specific questions about a lot of stuff. And there are Republicans that want to be involved in this decision-making process and in the oversight and the administration of this war, not because they think it's a bad idea, but because they think it is a good idea, because they want to support that effort. And they are frustrated by the fact that the administration has cut them off. I had a very lengthy back and forth with Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina, who said, I want to be able to go back and sell this war to my constituents. I want to be able to convince them that this is worth the expense of blood and treasure by our military and by our taxpayers. But I can't do that if you're not looping me into this process and making me a partner in this effort. But what we're seeing here, Yasmin, is that John Thune and Mike Johnson just don't want any part of this. You know, to hear Mike Johnson tell me that Congress has no role in this $25 billion worth of military spending and the effort and the expense that has been paid by our military members, 400 or so members of the military have been injured in this conflict so far. This is, it's just kind of shocking to me that the congressional leadership, Republican leadership, has just kind of been like, there's nothing to see here. We really don't have anything to do here.
Is there anything else that Congress can do here, especially when you mention conversations like the one that you had with Tom Tillis? Could they feasibly withhold funding from Israel? Could they reject the ask by the Secretary of Defense, by the Defense Department for their budget? Is there anything else they could do because of what seems to be the lack of transparency the members of Congress feel like they're getting?
So I think the next pressure point will be when they come hat in hand looking for a supplemental budget request to help to continue to fund the conflict. There's no way around that. You know, in many ways, the War Powers Act, the authorization of the use of military force, that is symbolic, but the money is the lifeblood of this military operation. And, you know, the Pentagon has a lot of money, but this is an expense that goes above and beyond what they had budgeted for. So at some point, they're going to come to Congress and say, we need all this extra money. They're not going to be able to continue on this path without at least forcing Congress to be involved on some level.
The president is saying we're not at war, it seems. The Speaker of the House is saying we're not at war. Hegseth is saying it's on pause. We're talking about, you know, the economy amidst all of this, because this president has been all about the economy. That's what he got elected on. Gas prices are still on the rise. Inflation is rising as well. They're asking for all this money at the Pentagon to fund potentially this war. How does the president justify this? How do members of Congress justify all of this money that is being spent that they cannot necessarily account for going into the midterms, especially as Americans are struggling financially?
Yeah. So it's not just the taxpayer expense, but you alluded to it, and it's also the expense out of everybody's pocketbooks when they go to the gas pump, when they go to the grocery store, when the farmers go to buy fertilizer. Those are all things that are a direct result of what's happening in Iran. And Trump's prediction is the second the conflict ends, the gas prices will tumble and they'll come down and be even lower than they were before the conflict because they will have more control over the flow of oil from that region. And that'll bring prices down across the board.
But it's not happening now. If we're not at war, we would be seeing that happen, and it's not happening. So that actually is not bearing out, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's a ton of contradictory statements in all of this, right? In that interview I did with Mike Johnson, he said, on one hand, we are trying to broker a peace, but at the same time, we're not at war. Well, how do you broker a peace? What are you brokering a peace from if we're not at war? And Trump repeatedly calls it a war over and over again. They're now saying it's the end of hostilities, but yet they still have all this military presence in the region. You're right. I mean, if the major part of the war is already over, why is it the gas prices are still skyrocketing?
So take us behind the scenes of a potential solve from the president's perspective and from members of Congress' perspective, because we're getting reporting here at NBC News that amidst this ceasefire between Iran and the U.S., Iran is digging out weapons that they had hid underground or that were buried beneath rubble from U.S. and Israeli airstrikes. We're reporting that they are preparing to restore their drone and missile capabilities if the president decides to start military operations back up. That is according to a U.S. official and two other people familiar with the matter. So when you're seeing that reporting, hearing that reporting, seeing the blockade continuing at the Strait of Hormuz, how the world economy is essentially being choked out because Iran is recognizing they can weaponize the Strait of Hormuz amidst all of this. What are we hearing behind the scenes from members of Congress, from the president, as to how they find a solve to this, what is an ongoing war in the Middle East?
Well, I can tell you from a congressional perspective, they don't have any idea. They are not being looped in on a granular level. They feel frustrated that the administration is not providing them more information, that it feels as though it's kind of a run and gun mentality. It's a lot of happy talk. It's a lot of, we've been so successful up until this point. You just need to trust us. There isn't a very specific and manageable plan that at least is being shared with Congress, which is kind of how we started this conversation about the lack of communication between the two ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. You know, from an administration standpoint, you know, you just have to listen to what the president says about this. I really don't think that there's a lot of behind the scenes maneuvering that betrays anything of what the president is saying publicly. He's saying on one hand that they want a deal, but he's not exactly sure who it is that they're trying to deal with, that they're not even exactly sure 100% who's in charge in Iran, but that he also reserves the right to blow them to smithereens, that he will completely decimate and destroy the entire country if that's what it takes to make sure that they don't get a nuclear weapon going forward.
Ryan Nobles, it is a happy Friday. Okay, let's just manifest that for
Yasmin. My theory is any time spent with you is happy.
Oh,
right?
My God. What a charmer, this guy. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Yas.
Shortly after our conversation with Ryan, President Trump sent letters to the House and the Senate saying that despite hitting this 60-day mark, he does not need Congress's authorization for military operations in Iran because there has been, quote, no exchange of fire between the United States forces and Iran since the ceasefire began on April 7th, and the hostilities have been terminated. We should note, however, the U.S. has continued the naval blockade of Iranian ports, and Iran is keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed. So two of Silicon Valley's most powerful people, Sam Altman and Elon Musk, have been battling it out in a California courtroom all week long. Musk is known as the CEO of Tesla, of X, and of SpaceX. But a decade ago, he was also one of the co-founders of OpenAI back when it was a nonprofit. He left its board back in 2018. Now, he's suing OpenAI and its CEO, Sam Altman, alleging that OpenAI's shift from a nonprofit organization to a for-profit business was unlawful. And Musk is demanding roughly $134 billion in damages from OpenAI and Microsoft, one of the company's biggest backers. Musk is also calling for Altman to be removed from his role at OpenAI. OpenAI's lawyers are calling Musk's claims, quote unquote, meritless and self-serving. They also allege that Musk advised OpenAI on creating a for-profit wing years ago. So what does this trial actually reveal about the inner workings of Silicon Valley, and how could it impact the future of artificial intelligence? David Ingram is a tech reporter for NBC News, and he has been in the courtroom all week long, and he's joining us now. Hi, David.
Hello.
So it's been a really busy week. Elon Musk has been on the witness stand for the majority of the week. Take a step back for a moment, if you will, and walk us through what this trial, this case is actually about and what Musk wants from Sam Altman.
So like a lot of court trials, this is about both the past and the future. OpenAI was founded in 2015 as a nonprofit. It's gone through some changes since then. It has a for-profit arm. So the trial is about what is OpenAI now? What was it supposed to be when it started? And what is it going to be in the future? There are a lot of subjects in the trial, including, will AI robots eventually kill us? The credibility, of course, of Elon Musk and Sam Altman as individuals. But the core of the issue and what the judge has really tried to focus on is this idea of the charity and the specific accusation from Musk that Sam Altman and the other leaders of OpenAI have tried to enrich themselves through a charitable organization, or what is supposed to be a charitable organization. Musk has a very simple message here, which is that OpenAI leaders have tried to steal a charity And we're going to see a lot of focus on that from Musk. And also in the coming weeks, we're going to hear rebuttals on that from Sam Altman's side.
So let's talk about Elon Musk being on the stand now, because he has been on the stand for several days. That is now wrapped. He was cross-examined as well. He's a pretty litigious individual, litigious guy. That's how he runs his businesses. So he knows how to be on the stand. He likely has a strong team of lawyers, considering the amount of money that he has. What are some of the things that stood out to you in his testimony?
So Musk was on the stand for about 7 hours in total over 3 days. So we really got to see his personality, warts and all, come out on the stand. He was at different times, I think, trying to be very charming with the jury. He's sort of put in posturing a little bit as a white knight who was wronged by, he was a charitable giver that he says he gave $38 million to OpenAI. He was wronged, and now he wants to sweep in as the self-made person with good intentions, specifically with the good intentions of saving humanity from killer robots. And he wants to save this nonprofit that he created from Sam Altman, who he's portraying as the bad guy. And the message from Musk and his side is these guys are trying to steal a charity. That OpenAI has been a charity. It's suddenly a for-profit, according to Musk, and they're trying to make themselves rich. And I think the OpenAI side is still working out exactly a message to counter that is as simple as Musk's. And we can get into that, but I think their main argument is that, look, it's still a charity. Like there is a nonprofit foundation that is ultimately still in charge at OpenAI.
So here's the thing, because I'm sure a lot of people know this, but everybody knows kind of what xAI is, right? It seems that is a for-profit AI company that Elon Musk founded back in 2023. It never started as a nonprofit. It started as a for-profit company. And so now you have folks essentially saying, especially critics of this trial, that this isn't about Musk trying to save humanity, that, OpenAI is supposed to remain as a nonprofit. This is instead about Musk trying to stomp out the competition, especially with all of the trillions of dollars at this point investment that we're seeing in AI across the board.
This is where we really saw sort of the gamesmanship on the stand from Musk. So OpenAI's lawyer, Bill Savitt, was asking some of these same questions. You started xAI 2023 as a for-profit. Why didn't you, you didn't start it as a nonprofit, did you? Yes or no? And Musk, he didn't want to answer these questions yes or no. He kept going back to this same argument of, well, they stole my charity. And this is the question that's going to be one of the questions that'll be before the jury is credibility of Musk. Was he really interested in a nonprofit? Is that really what he's doing here? Or is he just trying to take down a competitor to his own company now, xAI? He's been asked about this on the stand, and his answer has been, actually, xAI isn't really a competitor. He said that they're a distant fifth in the AI race. So he's trying to rebut the argument.
But it's still it's still in the same market, it's still doing the same types of things, wanting to make the same offers, right?
Absolutely. And it's absolutely doing, absolutely in the same market. Grok, his AI app, is directly competing with ChatGPT.
So in lockstep with this idea of whether or not Musk is actually trying to stomp out his competition, and or maybe he's angry that he didn't get what he wanted from OpenAI, especially when it came to the leadership, Altman's kind of side has claimed that Musk never fulfilled his $1 billion commitment to the company, which Musk actually confirmed on the stand this week, and that Musk quit when Altman and co-founders refused to let him control OpenAI or absorb it into Tesla. So as we keep that in mind, David, I know that Sam Altman's going to be taking a stand. What are we expecting from his testimony?
So I think we're going to see a lot of focus on what OpenAI currently is. So OpenAI completed a restructuring back in October. They now have some big outside investors. They have Microsoft as one of their big outside investors. Employees get have gotten shares. Other outside investors have gotten shares. And also the foundation that is the umbrella organization for OpenAI also has a share. It's a minority stake. They don't have a majority of the for-profit company, but they've got a sizable minority. And I think what we're going to hear from Altman is an attempt to have yet another, again, simplified narrative here of the foundation is still in charge, and also the foundation is healthy. The lawyer for OpenAI told us yesterday in a briefing that this is the best capitalized nonprofit in the world, and it's essentially a model for other kind of nonprofits. That nothing has been stolen, and again, also that Musk agreed 9 years ago or so that yes, OpenAI would eventually need to raise money from outside investors in order to accomplish its goals, and to attract the best talent and to build these models.
So we talked about how much money Musk is asking for. He's also asking for Sam Altman to be removed from his roles at OpenAI. And listen, his reputation, it seems, Altman so far a little bit has been tarnished, could get further tarnished by this ongoing trial, which may also be one of Elon Musk's motivations. And he was briefly fired and then rehired at OpenAI. There are folks inside of the company that say that Altman has not been completely honest about the direction that he wanted to take the company. Is there any possibility that Elon Musk could actually move the needle on that and get Sam Altman removed from running OpenAI?
I think if the jury and the judge here find that Altman and OpenAI are reliable, that they have enriched themselves unjustly at the expense of a charity, a verdict like that is going to hit the AI industry like a lightning bolt. Especially if the remedy ends up being something like the shares that we thought were valued at one thing are actually valued at another thing, or as you said, part of the remedy that Musk is seeking is Altman and Brockman being fired from the OpenAI board or being disqualified as officers. Would they go somewhere else? Would OpenAI employees go somewhere else? Would they go to competitors, including potentially xAI or Anthropic or Google? I think we would see a complete shakeup probably of this whole sector and the general push toward AI if the judge and the jury agree with Musk.
David Ingram, thank you.
You're welcome.
That is going to do it for us at Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yasmin Vasugian. We'll be back Monday with whatever the weekend may bring. And if you like what you heard and you saw, press the subscribe button. We'll see you Monday.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.